Well, Director, faculty, staff, students, council, and friends of St. Mark's National Theological Centre, sisters and brothers, it's an honour and privilege to have been invited to give this commencement lecture, and one for which I'm truly grateful. It's exactly 25 years since I was a full-time teacher in a theological college in Bristol, England, but I well recall that unique mix of feelings accompanying the start of a new academic year. On the one hand, that unique mix of, on the one hand, the pleasure of the sense of continuity in the life of the college and its tradition. On the other, always a sense of change in the air. However subtle, changes brought by a new intake of students and all the incremental adjustments in teaching programs, new members of staff. From time to time, major changes in quite new departures and experiments that are made in the curriculum and teaching methods, the outcomes of which we anticipate in hope but never certainty. But there also are the changes brought upon us like a series of surf waves in successive years, which are requiring continual adjustment in the way we think and act. And foremost among these today is the digital revolution, so-called. For myself, just how quickly, as well as profoundly, the changes swept over us is registered when I reflect that if someone had asked me, when I left teaching at Bristol Baptist College in 1990, how the digital revolution would affect theological education, I would not have had a clue what they were on about. Now I am dependent on my laptop, email, and the internet as much as anyone else. I admit to being on Facebook. Consulting Wikipedia when I'm in a hurry is the best kept secret of my life, as it is of most other writers and academics. Life is indeed being digitalized. Some of us will recall the time when "go to your bedroom and stay there till I say" was the standard parental sanction against wayward offspring. Today, one is more likely to hear, "Are you ever going to come out of that bedroom, or are you chained to that damn computer?" Life is indeed being digitalized. In theological education, no less than elsewhere, and in theological education too. In academia, from classroom tuition to library and resource provision, to research methods, and of course to further forms of teaching by extension or learning at a distance. Yet our submersion in the digital revolution is marked by a distinct ambivalence. The opportunities and the dangers, the imagined gains it offers and the alleged threats it poses to human creativity and quality of thought, at every level, from the personal to the social and global. Commenting on a recent statement by Pope Francis that the internet is a gift from God, journalist Tom Hennigan recently observed, "If that's the case, one wonders what message the Almighty wanted to send with this kind of present." The internet, he says, does many good things for religion, such as informing people about each other's faiths and providing a forum for serious discussion about them. But the same medium that can foster understanding also spreads polarization and deepens existing prejudices. This divine gift sends some decidedly mixed messages, unquote. Another observer, Catherine Lofton, comments that the provision of information has always, since the invention of the printing press, always been an ambiguous phenomenon, as much a matter of control by the providers of information as of our freedom to access and use it, not to mention the sheer dangers of overload. The sheer abundance of information gives the impression of total freedom and equality of access by us, its users. But she also asks, might this in fact be a ploy to hide the subtle fact of coercion, masquerading as more free, less hierarchical, less stumbling, and less regulatory. I quote, "Networks craft trails promising true spirit and unmitigated relation, effecting the connections we truly desire, where propositions about unbeatable freedoms counter any claims of coercion." And she says, "Yes, there is so much more stuff, but is there any more encounter with it?" Indeed, the image of the lone adolescent hooked on his or her bedroom computer raises the spectre not of a new level of human communication, but of an unbridled, individualistic, isolated mode of existence. Notice Catherine Lofton's ironic comment, just quoted, about the connections we truly desire. Connections. Only connect is a watchword of the digital age, as if human relations are simply a matter of pressing a keyboard. The phrase only connect derives from E.M. Forster in his novel Howard's End, written over a century ago in 1910. But its typical usage today is a total misrepresentation of Forster's own meaning. Forster was not referring to relations between persons, but to connecting, what he said, the prose and the passion in a single person's life, which is a source of human creativity and leads to the expression of love at its highest. One may ask whether the digital age might in fact be separating, not uniting, the prose and the passion in our lives today, drowning out the passion by the sheer amount of prose. Or, as we might say, connectedness does not necessarily mean community. Well, this brings us to the subject I've been asked to address, life together, quotation marks, in a digital age, quotation marks. Life Together being, of course, the title of one of the most widely read books by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Lutheran pastor, leading theologian in the German church struggle, martyr of the resistance against Hitler, and overall one of the preeminent Christian figures of the 20th century. That book is especially relevant to theological education, for Bonhoeffer wrote it out of the experience of leading an illegal seminary of the confessing church from 1935. And in every branch of Christian tradition, theological education has generally been viewed as a communal enterprise. The very word college, deriving from the Latin collegium, which in ancient Rome denoted a club or society of people living together under a common set of rules, implies this. So does that intriguing word seminary, an Anglicization of the Latin seminarium, seedbed, which was brought into use particularly by the Roman Catholic Church as part of the reforms of the Council of Trent in the 16th century, but has now been widely adopted, no less in Protestant circles too. For this reason, I was interested to note that while St. Mark's is the National Theological Centre, on your website it's quick to describe itself as a scholarly Christian theological community, as indeed was emphasized in that most appropriate opening service we've just experienced this evening. But why should theological education be a communal affair? Is it just for the obvious pragmatic considerations of efficiency and convenience of dealing with numbers? The status quo, the status that corporate bodies can confer on their alumni, which applies to all forms of higher education? Here is where Dietrich Bonhoeffer becomes especially challenging. And I say challenging and not just relevant because, as we often find with Bonhoeffer, he typically does not provide answers to our questions, but poses questions of his own to start with. For him, the starting point is not what is the best or most effective form of theological education, but what is the church? He addressed this question in the doctoral thesis, completed at the outrageously young age of 21 and published in 1930, as Sanctorum Communio, the communion of saints. The church, argues Bonhoeffer, is not a religious association of like-minded pious people. It's nothing less than, quotes, Christ existing as community. The young Bonhoeffer had been captivated by Karl Barth's emphasis on God as the holy other God, who is made known only through his word in Jesus Christ. But Bonhoeffer wanted to go further than Barth and to know where and how this word actually impacts on us and becomes known to us, how revelation becomes earthed, concrete. And his answer is, as the earthly human community that lives under his word, the word of the forgiveness of sins. The church community is formed in response to the word of Christ and consists of relationships of its members one to another, relationships which in turn express the way Christ relates to us. Jesus is the one who has acted vicariously on our behalf to the point of bearing our sins. Members of his body, in turn, act vicariously one to another. Indeed, they are, as Martin Luther put it, and Bonhoeffer was following Luther at this point, become Christ to one another. There's a word that Bonhoeffer introduces in Sanctorum Communio and uses again throughout many of his other works, the German word Stellvertretung. It's an almost impossible word to translate neatly into English. The older translations of Bonhoeffer use the word, nice word, deputyship. I have to own up to a corporate responsibility, as it were, for the New English tradition, because it uses a very cumbersome, ungainly word, which is probably accurate, but is an insult to the English language. It talks about vicarious representative action. This is how Christ relates to us and how we as his members relate to one another in the community of word and sacrament. Vicarious representative action. The church, to repeat, is not a religious association. It's nothing less than the new humanity established by Jesus Christ, the new Adam. Now, Bonhoeffer, in this early, very youthful thesis, was not, of course, giving an exact description of how the Protestant church of his day was actually living in all times and places. The actuality of German Protestantism, and not just German either, was painfully different. Its bourgeois individualism had left it with little appeal to the masses of urban poor. In 1932, just before the advent of Hitler, unemployment in Germany peaked at 6 million, about 33% of the population. And Protestantism had little of appeal and little way of addressing the plight of urban mass poverty. Equally, it was vulnerable in face of the mass appeal of National Socialism and Hitler's dynamic form of connectedness on the basis of blood, race, and soil. The young Bonhoeffer saw a realization of genuinely communal life as crucial to the renewal of his church in face of these challenges, and above all, in the preparation of its pastors. In Germany, as in many other places at the time, the characteristic method of procedure for ordination was to, as in any other profession, to seek a university degree and qualification, more or less on your own. That qualified you for the profession. And while he was a young lecturer in the University of Berlin during the years 1931-32, he began experimenting with forms of community life involving some of his university class students in weekend retreats and conferences. Hitler's advent to power in January 1933 threw Bonhoeffer into the heart of the church struggle of Germany in opposition to the efforts of the so-called German Christian movement and the Reich authorities to create a church conforming to Nazi practice and ethos, for example, excluding so-called non-Aryans, which in most cases meant Jewish people, from its ministry. He transferred, as has been said, to London in late 1933 as pastor there for 18 months. But he was no less involved in the church struggle, promoting the cause of the confessing church, that church which was effectively founded in May 1934 on the basis of the famous theological declaration of Barmen, the Barmen Synod, which declared that Christ alone was the source of faith and obedience for the church, not any other power, religious or political. But all this time, Bonhoeffer was still reflecting ever more deeply on the need for a recovery of Christian community as a means of resistance to Nazification and the renewal of the church, enabling the church, he hoped, to withstand the pressures of nationalism, racism, and resurgent militarism. While still in his London pastorate in January 1935, there's a most interesting letter he wrote to his brother, Carl Friedrich Bonhoeffer, who was a physicist, in which he said that Western Christianity and German Protestantism in particular could only find its true vocation in a new attachment to the Sermon on the Mount. Quotes, "Here alone lies the force that can blow all this hocus-pocus sky high. The restoration of the church must surely depend on a new kind of monasticism, which has nothing to do with the old, but a life of uncompromising discipleship following Christ according to the Sermon on the Mount. I believe the time has come to gather people together and do this." End quote. And the opportunity for doing precisely this came just 4 months later in May 1935, when Bonhoeffer was summoned back to Germany by the Confessing Church to take charge of one of its illegal seminaries for training pastors. Before returning, having already visited several free church colleges in England, Bonhoeffer made a tour of Anglican religious houses and was especially impressed by those at Kelham and Mirfield in Yorkshire. Back in Germany in May 1935, a site was found for the seminary in the rural far east of Germany on the Baltic coast, suitably remote, it was hoped, from the attentions of the Gestapo. For a short time, it was housed in beach huts on the coastal resort of Zingst, but soon moved to a former school in the village, soon to become famous because of the seminary, the village of Finkenwalde, where it remained for the next 2 years. Physical conditions in the rundown school building were Spartan, to say the least, and the daily routine was rigorous in a way that these students, most of whom had just come through university education, had rarely experienced. As well as classes in doctrine, pastoralia, and homiletics, there were lengthy sessions of prayer and Bible readings, both morning and evening, sometimes midday too, together with long periods of silent meditation together and in private. There were other surprises for these students too. On the first evening of the semester, at the close of supper, Bonhoeffer asked for volunteers to help with the washing up. When after a few minutes no one had moved, he himself gathered the dishes onto a tray and disappeared into the kitchen. Thereupon several students tried to follow him, but found the kitchen door locked. Their lesson in communal living had begun in earnest. More was to follow. Finkenwalde was not just a class of ordinands under a teacher, more a community of brothers under Jesus Christ and his word. Bonhoeffer soon let it be known that he himself was not to be addressed as Herr Direktor, but Bruder Bonhoeffer, Brother Bonhoeffer. Ordinands were not there simply to study for their own benefit, but to learn their dependency on each other and to help each other in becoming responsible theologians in the service of the church. The single rule that Bonhoeffer laid down for the life of the seminary was that no one should talk to another brother about another brother behind his back. Eberhard Bethge, one of the first arrivals among the ordinands and who was to become Bonhoeffer's closest friend and biographer, remarks that it was in trying to keep this rule that they learned perhaps at least as much as in any lecture or sermon. I wonder if the corresponding rule today is no blind use of blind copy on your email. As if this was not enough, after a while, Bonhoeffer gently introduced to the community the practice of personal confession, one to another. Although Bonhoeffer appealed to Luther as authority for this discipline, it added fuel to the accusations among some students, and people outside as well, about the Catholicizing tendencies of Finkenwalde. After a time, too, a kind of inner core of community was set up, the House of Brethren, a permanent small community of pastors who would stand ready to help in confessing church parishes which were, for one reason or another, without a pastor. But Finkenwalde was not all work and no play. Life together included music and singing, birthday parties, swimming, strenuous ball games, the reading of good literature, plenty of time for free and open discussion on all matters, including political events of the day, as well as church affairs. It was life together, not just study together. Put more theologically, it was realizing in a concrete way the theme of Sanctorum Communio, Christ existing as community. But the Finkenwalde Seminary, as such, was comparatively short-lived. After just 2 years, during which 113 students in total had passed through, it was closed down by order of the Gestapo. But the Finkenwalde Fellowship remained alive and grew. The work of ordination training continued for another 3 years into the first year of the war in a still more clandestine way, called the collective pastorates. Students were attached, they were dispersed, but attached in small groups to confessing church parishes in remote areas of further Pomerania, brought together at intervals in retreats and study conferences. In a real sense, both the study and community life therefore continued by extension, as may be seen from the regular circular letters Bonhoeffer wrote to both past and present students, still addressing them as the Finkenwalde Brethren. These letters are often moving to read, giving news of brothers imprisoned or otherwise persecuted, and of course, once war broke out, of those being drafted into the army and killed, as so many were on the Eastern Front. It was a very convenient method for the regime to get rid of dissident pastors to fight on the Russian front. In September 1939, just a few weeks after the war broke out, he writes in his circular letter, "I sincerely ask you to inform me as soon as someone is drafted or if someone is missing from the list about whom I have not been informed. Please let me know every army postal number that you learn of. Take time now, as often as possible, to write to the brothers out there. Above all, let us not neglect the greatest service that remains for us to do, the service of the faithful daily intercessory prayer." It also should be pointed out that in his seminary discipline at Finkenwalde, Bonhoeffer was concerned to get his students used to the idea of being alone as well as together. In one of his most epigrammatic sentences, he says, if you're afraid of community, don't be alone. If you're afraid of being alone, don't go for community. Learn to be alone as well as together. Finkenwalde remained a community even while everyone was scattered, even into the chaos of war. There's no more telling example of a testimony to what the Finkenwalde experience meant to so many of its students than a letter written to Bonhoeffer in February 1939 by one of the students who'd been assigned to a collective pastorate, Gerhard Lehner, who himself was to die in the war. He'd gone, on his own admission, very, very reluctantly to the Finkenwalde circuit. He shuddered, he said, at the thought of this period of physical and spiritual confinement. But afterwards, he writes to Bonhoeffer in these words. He says, "It all turned out differently than I'd feared. Instead of coming into the stuffy air of theological bigotry, I entered a world that united many things that I love and need. Accurate theological work on the common ground of fellowship, in which one's own inabilities were never noticed in a hurtful fashion, but rather which turned work into pleasure. True fellowship under the word that united all without respect to persons. And nonetheless with open-mindedness and love for everything that makes even this fallen creation still worthy of love. Music, literature, sports, and the beauty of the earth. A generous style of life that favorably combined the culture of old homes with the uninhibited forms of a community of young men. Last not least, a man in charge whom one can indeed admire without reservation. I love that phrase, a generous style of life, even when they were so in a state of privation, physically and in every other way as well. But we mustn't, however, lose sight of the fact that Finkenwalde and its continuing fellowship wasn't just a remarkable example of Christian community as an end in itself. It was seriously intentional as a means of training pastors for a ministry of building up a church in resistance to the Nazi state and ethos. Their training had itself to be in conformity with the church as true community, as Christ existing as community. Finkenwalde was therefore to be seen not as a cosy refuge of Christian fellowship away from the threatening world, but as countercultural to its context. It was in the first place, as we've seen, countercultural to the received individualistic ethos of contemporary Protestantism. Even more, it was countercultural to the willingness of so many in the German evangelical church to conform to the Nazi order being imposed on the church, especially the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle, which was copied by the Reich Church with the imposition of a state-appointed Reich Bishop Müller and the use of state commissars to impose order and authority by sheer power over the church and to dismiss all dissidents. It's interesting that the Barmen Declaration, just those of you who know the Barmen Declaration, should remind you, did not include just that wonderful opening theological thesis about Jesus Christ being the one word of God we have to obey and hear and trust in life and in death. We reject other powers and principalities. But it goes on in several other theses, and there's one especially important. It says, we affirm that the church is a community of brotherly mutual service, where leadership takes the form of following Christ, the servant Lord. And so Finkenwalde was to be a community of brothers equally bound together under the word of Christ in mutual service and intercession, a very different kind of church to that being demanded by the triumphist politics of the hour. And whenever you hear the word leadership in the church, perhaps we should pick up our ears and say, what kind of leadership are we asking for? Indeed, the kind of culture represented by Finkenwalde was in marked contrast to other features of society in Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was not, as sometimes, well, often in popular imagination, a unified monolith of utter subservience to Hitler. It was a snake pit in many respects, a snake pit of rival groups, self-seeking factions competing for the Führer's approval, whether in the military, the SS, the civil service, or even within the party itself. It was a society of deep mutual mistrust. Finkenwalde represented in microcosm an alternative kind of togetherness based on freedom expressed in willing mutual service, trust, and genuine friendship. And it's significant that so many of the students who did survive, first of all, Finkenwalde itself, and then survived the war, became outstanding leaders in Germany, both in East and West Germany as well. It's significant that Bonhoeffer sat down and wrote Life Together in 1937, immediately after the closure of Finkenwalde, together with finalizing that other great fruit of his time there, his book, Discipleship. Evidently, he was anxious to make clear that the theological principles on which Finkenwalde had been based would have wider applications, and not just to the forthcoming collective pastorates scheme either. They were relevant to wherever and however Christian community is sought, for example, in any congregation or a family, as well as a seminary. So we find in Life Together some very forthright arguments as to what should and should not be looked for in community. First and foremost, he stresses that the visible community and the physical presence of other Christians is a divine gift and blessing. That said, however, he warns against simply wanting a community that fulfills our desires. Christian community is community through and in Jesus Christ. We need other Christians because it is they who will speak God's word to us. The community is of God's choosing, not ours. We recall again our reading from John's Gospel we heard earlier. Hence, Christian community is far removed from any wishful, romantic dream we might have of the delights of fellowship. He writes very sternly, I quote, "On innumerable occasions, a whole Christian community has been shattered because it has lived on the basis of a wishful image. A great disillusionment with others, with Christians in general, and if we are fortunate, with ourselves, is bound to overwhelm us as surely as God desires to lead us to an understanding of genuine Christian community. By sheer grace, God will not permit us to live in a dream world, even for a few weeks, and to abandon ourselves to those blissful experiences and exalted moods that sweep over us like a wave of rapture. For God is not a God of emotionalism, but of truth." End quote. It's thankfulness for the community and its members as they are, not our dream of what they should be, that holds a true community together. In fact, Life Together at times, I feel, reads like a deterrent to seeking community rather than an advocacy of it, as Bonhoeffer warns of the dubious motives that may underlie our desire to be with others. I quote again, and we won't like this, all of us, I know, "The Christian community is not a spiritual sanatorium. Those who take refuge in community while fleeing from themselves are misusing it to indulge in empty talk and distraction, no matter how spiritual this idle talk and distraction may appear. In reality, they're not seeking community at all, but only a thrill that will allow them to forget their isolation for a short time. It's precisely such misuse of community that creates the deadly isolation of human beings. Such attempts to find healing result in the undermining of speech and all genuine experience, and finally, resignation and spiritual death." At Finkenwalde, Bonhoeffer was teaching against the dangers of cheap grace and teaching instead costly grace, costly discipleship. And here he is warning against cheap community, or what we might call sheer connectedness. True community is costly, where people learn to be one in the humility of mutual listening, mutual bearing, practical helpfulness, forgiveness, and, as he keeps reminding us, intercession. True community, Christ existing as community, comes where people place themselves together under the truth of Christ and find that truth made real in encounter with one another as real human beings in all their peculiarity, awkwardness, and sinfulness. I think Bonhoeffer would cheerfully endorse that beautiful misquotation of the Apostles' Creed, that we believe in the communion of sins and the forgiveness of saints. And in his own words, he states, "Christ made us into the community of faith, and in that community made the other Christian to be grace for us. Now each stands in Christ's place. In the presence of another Christian, I no longer need to pretend. In another Christian's presence, I am permitted to be the sinner that I am. For there alone, in all the world, the truth and mercy of Jesus Christ rule." Bonhoeffer clearly believed that the formation of pastors, shepherds of community, ipso facto had to be a formation in community, a community which meant the physical presence of other ordinands, just as Christ could only be present to us fully as the fully incarnate one. But Bonhoeffer also knew by 1937 that the literal physicality of community life could not be available to everyone all the time, as it happened when Finkenwalde was there. He maintained this view during the period of the collective pastorates. Moreover, even when these had vanished under the tide of war, and even during his own imprisonment. In one of his last surviving letters to Eberhard Bethge in August 1944 from prison, when Bonhoeffer was at his most isolated from everyone, knowing what his likely fate was now to be, he writes, "What is certain is that in all this we stand within a community that sustains us." That is why I think he can still speak so pertinently to us in this digital age as we explore how far we can go in creating communities which may not be able to involve any physical meeting all the time. True community is rooted in, but not confined to, the experience of physical fellowship. The core of Christian community is of people, even just 2 or 3, sitting at a table, hearing the same word, breaking the same bread, and drinking from the same cup. Our faith is irreducibly physical in origin, as are Bethlehem and Calvary. Our faith community originates in incarnation and finds its goal in incarnate action in the world. Perhaps we should think of community as like a vine, which has to be rooted in the soil at one particular point, but which can be allowed to spread and luxuriate in foliage and fruit over a very wide area. Perhaps the most obvious danger to our faith posed by the digital age is in the endless possibility of words, circulating in the ether from terminal to terminal as ends in themselves. The Scottish poet Edwin Muir has a beautiful poem, The Incarnate One, in which he sketches a picture of the hyper-Calvinist church on a rugged headland overlooking the grey, cold sea, in which he said, words are impaled on an abstract dogma. Summed up, he says, the word made flesh is here made word again. But the same holds true whenever words become too easy and theology, like everything else, becomes a verbal game in which never touches human reality, a de-incarnated faith. Bonhoeffer in prison acknowledged this in his later writings as a danger for a church marginalized in the modern world, a church which would, after Hitler, perhaps no longer be persecuted, but perhaps not noticed either. A church which could only recover an authentic way of speaking by undergoing the secret discipline of prayer and righteous action. This means a simple but stark test for measuring the worth of our theological talk. How does what we are doing, how does what we are talking about originate from the incarnate Jesus Christ and lead towards specific incarnate action in the world and in the church too? This in itself gives us a means of identifying where we are being invited into true community and where we are being offered a spurious connectedness. For example, by the conveyors or the purveyors of consumer products, which claim to be making us members of a certain privileged community if we buy their products, those in the know, or which promise us a trouble-free life insulated from the pain and suffering of the world about us, or even a religious company, a religious togetherness of those specially blessed by God with personal happiness now and a seat in heaven hereafter. All these are forms of individualism masquerading as community because they do not involve any encounter, real encounter with other persons. We can perhaps learn something from other disciplines here. I was interested to read not long ago that when he became director of the Royal College of Music in London, Sir David Wilcox insisted that each student, whatever his or her instrument, and however brilliant a soloist he was or she was becoming at that instrument or voice, had to attend the weekly hour of communal choral singing by all students together in the college. Theological education as a communal enterprise clearly has much to gain from the digital breakthroughs of our time, provided again that a test is applied to the methods used as to whether they promote not just a sense of connectedness, but an actual interdependence among those studying and teaching. Education in our age is some quarters tending to become a commodity to be purchased for oneself, a qualification or status to be possessed, letters after one's name, an individualistic pursuit of status, perhaps even power. The internet can be used as a main provider of individual attainment, just as in online shopping. But theological education, whether for ordained or the increasingly important lay ministries of our time, must be inherently communal. Because ministry and witness in the world must be communal too, for that is God's purpose in Christ for humanity. During the war, shortly before his imprisonment, Bonhoeffer prepared a draft for a proclamation from the pulpit in the event of a successful overthrow of the Nazi regime, in which he included a special word for pastors on behalf of the conspirators if they were successful. We call you, pastors, to a new order for your life. We've suffered long enough with each wanting to go his own way and separating himself from his brother. That was the spirit not of Christ, but of willfulness, of indolence, of defiance. No pastor today can do justice to his ministry alone. He needs his brother. We ask you to call on the help of mutual conversation and personal confession, and we lay upon each one as a holy duty of office to make yourselves available to one another for this service. We ask you to come together to prepare your sermons with prayer and to help one another find the right words. A ruined, demoralized, and confused Germany could only be helped by a church in which pastors and people had learned to accept, trust, and actively help each other. Is our context today so very different in its need for such solidarity in order to supply the courage for public articulation of Christian faith, for speaking truth to power, and addressing justice and peace as the true goals of political life? And should not this communal factor be built into theological education and preparation for ministry? The communal factor need not necessarily be diluted by the arrival of online learning and learning at a distance, provided, first, that it is a requirement that students do physically meet at regular intervals for common worship, study, and other activities, and that this is recognized to be the core of their life together. And second, that the teaching methods themselves enable and require students, even while apart, actually to be of help and service to one another in their theological explorations and spiritual development, a cooperative, not a competitive venture. With careful thought and pastoral monitoring, technology can surely be the ally rather than the enemy here. The new digital technology is not the answer to all our problems, nor need it be the greatest danger to the enterprise of theological study and teaching. It is to be our servant, not our master. The internet cannot itself create community, but can be its instrument. Crucially, one thing it can't do is supply the vision and energy that infuse the theological task. That has to come from our faith and spirituality. At this point, we can return to E.M. Forster's dictum, only connect, in its true meaning. We are to connect the prose and the passion. The digital age, especially the internet, supplies the prose, miles and miles of it. We have to find the right points on it to be ignited by the passion of faith in the living, passionate God of Jesus Christ in the power of the Spirit. Amid all the plethora of words of our time, we have to discern, hear, and speak the word which awakes the world to its true life and future. In those words, the former prophet of my own country, G.K. Chesterton, from all that terror teaches, from lies of tongue and pen, from all the easy speeches that comfort cruel men, from sale and profanation of honor and the sword, from sleep and from damnation, deliver us, good Lord. The digital age can be an age of yet more easy speeches, in public life, in academia, or in the church. It can be an age which uses words to smother and deny the reality of conflicts, injustices, and suffering. The age of the internet can be used to proffer superficial connectedness, masquerading as community. In contrast, as Bonhoeffer said in a sermon to his congregation in London on Reformation Sunday 1934, in the midst of the church struggle and turmoil in his homeland, I quote, "The church that calls the people to believe in Christ must itself be, in the midst of the people, the burning fire of love, the nucleus of reconciliation, the source of the fire in which all hate is smothered, and proud, hateful people are transformed into loving people." St. Mark's, it's over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clements, for your words to us tonight. My apologies for confusing you earlier this evening with one of our eminent other lecturers in the School of Theology. We're very, very thankful for your exposition of Bonhoeffer's theology of community and for your really considered applications of it to our modern condition. We've heard of how the church is Christ existing as community, of how the holy other God has become known through Jesus Christ, with ourselves then called to be as Christ to each other, so representing God's new humanity to the world. We've learnt with Bonhoeffer that physical and visible presence to one another is indeed a divine blessing, but not for simply meeting our desires, but rather in and through Jesus Christ. So therefore, we've also heard of some falsehoods in true community. And you also mentioned the dubious motives that lie behind the formation and uses of community. And I really like the way you've noticed how these apply to those in virtual community just as much as for those in physical community. And likewise, the exhortation not to rely on community when we need to be alone and not to rely on aloneness when we need to be together must apply on the internet just as much as in a seminary. We've learnt of the formative power of willing mutual service and trust and friendship, and that it is possible to stand in a community that held Bonhoeffer and can hold us, irrespective of proximity to one another. You've very helpfully noted to us how the possibility of abstracted talk, of being lost among the symbols at the expense of the reality, can occur just as easily in physical communities as in virtual ones, but that perhaps virtual ones are maybe a little more prone to it. And that image of the vine, rooted in the soil of physical presence, but reaching out across time and distance, sounds to me as if it models an essential heuristic for the problem that we have before us and that we're struggling with theologically. So, Dr. Clements, this has given me great hope tonight, actually. There's a few things I want to raise with you in a moment that signal the particulars of our situation here, but your lecture has given me great hope, and your prescriptions and suggestions at the end offer the beginnings, I think, of careful theological scaffolding to our use of technology. I thank you so much for applying your theological mind to these matters, and we will be studying and digesting what you've said as we map our future. So I wonder if I could just put to you a couple of questions that will help us kind of test our situation here in Canberra. A preliminary question, I guess, just to clarify. How would you describe the differences, and I know we chatted about this in the car earlier today, how would you describe the differences between theological study that partners with a university, as ours does, as compared to theological study that occurs in a seminary such as Finkelwald?
Yeah, I don't think we should be dogmatic about this. I mean, Bonhoeffer himself was living in a situation, a very extreme situation in 1932-33, where the universities themselves had become so compromised by the Nazi state, and he himself was a junior lecturer in Berlin and tried to remain with a foothold in the public university as long as he could. But he held out no great hopes for it because of the pressures upon lecturers and students and staff and so on, that it was very difficult to maintain a true freedom of thought within the universities as they were then. I myself, from my own experience, think that the combination of what you might call seminary life and university life is a very rich one. I taught for years in Bristol Baptist College in the UK, where we were an associated college of the university. In fact, the university department of theology had grown out of the Baptist, Methodist, and congregational colleges as they were in Bristol then. So I think you have to think of perhaps of several concentric circles of education. There are those, obviously, who will be wanting to pursue theological education for its own sake. I had one university student came to me admitting, he says he discovered it, he wanted to study it simply because it was interesting. He said he wanted to go into the city stock market in London and make a lot of money afterwards. He was an atheist by belief, but he nevertheless found theology interesting. So, you know, there are people like that around. There are people who will want to be teachers in secular institutions as well, who will study it. People who, again, committed lay Christians who will want to study for their own interest. But I think for theological training, for ministry in the church, however we define that, whether it's ordained ministry or lay ministry, there has to be a certain intentionality about what we are about, that we are servants of the servant church. And this does have a certain distinct identity, not to be isolated from the church, but from the world, but to be enriched by encounter with it. But there is a certain specificity about ministerial training. And of course, I mean, one of the big changes these days, of course, is if we were talking about Bonhoeffer in modern context, as well as Bruder would be saying Schwester too, an inclusive community in that respect. That's one of the differences, perhaps, that separates our age from his, but I'm sure he would be very accepting of it. So I think seminary-type training, university-type training can certainly be in harness, one with another, to the benefit of both.
So my second question pertains to the, you started with some of the negatives that I think we've all experienced about the use of the internet, and yet you ended, I think, surprisingly and helpfully with some qualified optimism around that. The false kinds of community that Bonhoeffer warns us of do seem hard enough, I think, to overcome when we relate person to person. Does the mediation of relationship via technology have, I don't know, is it kind of neutral in this matter? Are they just basic primal human needs and errors that are upon us whether technology intervenes or not? Where does technology fit into our relationships?
I suppose, like with every form of communication, it has its pluses and minuses. I mean, I know people who say they have been extremely grateful for people they've discovered on the net with whom they have things in common and whom they've been able to meet later on and talk about things of common concern. So, by all means, you know, it's not all negative. What I just think is it all depends on our intentionality of it. What is our goal in using it? The net itself won't supply the community. We've got to look for it and foster it and nurture it. You know, there are people who obviously will misuse the internet for very destructive forms of relationship. We know about that. And the wrong uses of social media. But I think that puts even more onus on us, from our vision of what community and relationships are about, to use it for good.
The third of my four questions is overlapping, really. St Mark's works with hundreds of people through the internet. We also fight quite hard, I think, to bring people onto our site to meet face-to-face in residential schools. But the internet is the backbone of our distance education, and the opportunity and problem is heightened in Australia by just the vastness of distance. Can you just remind us again, in what sense can this infrastructure be turned into becoming a Christian community? Do you think that's doable? I've read opinions ranging on this ranging from absolutely no chance, you've got to be together in person, through to there is absolutely no difference. A virtual community is every bit as a real community. I wonder if you could just help us a little around that.
Well, maybe you can think of several real communities that meet together, rather like the collective pastorates were in Bonhoeffer's time. But I think from time to time, there would be a loss if there is not an actual physical meeting of people. I think there's something so deeply incarnational in our faith that it needs, at least from time to time, whatever the intervals are, some sort of rootedness of the vine in the soil of actual encounter. Now, I'm not saying that people in purely internet community can't grow into some deeper form of togetherness, But I think at certain points, the life together does need to be truly incarnational, rooted in common word and sacrament, however difficult or whatever long intervals that may be. I think so.
Now, my last week question is the one from left field. Feel free to say no comment. I love that image of seminary as a seedbed. One part of our operation here at St Mark's is to work on the formation of people for ministries. Conversely, it strikes me that the internet can be its own seedbed for all sorts of very different practices and formation. I really liked your mention of restraint in the BCC function as an analogue for one of the rules of Finkelwald. I really liked too that you signalled how Finkelwald represented Bonhoeffer's aspiration for a new kind of monasticism. So here's the question: is it conceivable, or am I being just kind of nuts with this? Is it conceivable that we might perhaps invent some kind of new monastic rule for the practice of online community? Is that thinkable, or does such a rule require the accountabilities that come with physical presence?
We might indeed do it, but I think there has to be some sort of agreed common discipline in it. I think that's what it would have to be. I mean, there are communities like this, like the Iona community, for example, based in Scotland, but there's a worldwide network of people who adopt a kind of common rule of life, and including discipline and use of their resources, acceptance of the need to work for justice and peace, and so on. I think you have to actually make people do things in the community. One of Bonhoeffer's rules about the community, or the practices, was to make sure that everyone had something specific to do in the communal life, so that everyone would feel of some use, even when they themselves felt useless. And I think you can't just have a community that says, oh, it's nice to belong, or we share some common ideas. There's got to be some practice in it. You know, the incarnation began on earth, it has to return on earth as well, so as to where we want to make a difference. Yeah.